Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and in this video, we're going to be looking at integration services. Integration services is one of the components of Microsoft's BI or Business Intelligence offering. And we'll briefly talk about the other two components as well, but in this video, we want to focus on here, integration services or SSIS. We'll talk about what is SSIS. We're going to get into installation and configuration, but just so you know, installation of integration services, if you've installed SQL Server, it's not a whole lot to really dive into there, but there are some configuration things, and we'll talk about that. And then last, we're going to look at creating and running a simple package. A full-blown discussion of integration services is really beyond the scope of this course and fits more under a business intelligence course. So that kind of stuff will probably be in another course. But I did want to at least give you the foundational information and some foundational skills for working with integration services. So starting with integration services as a component of BI. Well then, what is BI, right? Stands for business intelligence. You'll commonly hear the term BI, and you probably already have heard it. But it's all about the practice of taking massive amounts of raw data and turning it into something useful. That may seem kind of odd. Well, that's the whole point of the database, right? To have useful information. But that's not as easy as you might think, as the amount of the data in your data store becomes astronomically large. So what's astronomical? When you start talking about 10 billion customer records, right? Databases of that magnitude, it's not so easy anymore to find the trends and to find the pertinent information or the pertinent types of correlations in your data that are going to help drive your business. So BI is about giving you tools that'll help you to manage that type of level of information, that type of volume of information, and turn it into something useful for helping to drive your business goals and your business decisions. So BI is made up of three things when you're looking at SQL Server. First of all, there's integration services, or SSIS, stands for SQL Server Integration Services. And it is specifically focused on the integration of information from various data stores, bringing information in from all of the different databases that maybe you acquired as a result of the merger of other organizations. It's a really common thing right now in the banking industry. Lots of banks buying up other smaller banks. And now you've got this massive data store that may actually include multiple records that point to the same person. Let's assume they had accounts in more than one location. So you could end up with multiple pieces of information about the same person, as well as just lots of other information that may represent the same type of data. It may represent a birth date or state, but it might be represented differently. So integrating all that information together is the focus of integration services. Next, we have analysis services, or SQL Server Analysis Services. This is about analyzing the data. It gives you tools specifically for doing analysis on the information. And again, the goal is supporting your business decisions. And then the third tool is reporting services. Now, this is going to be used for creating, running, and maintaining custom reports. And I did say custom reports because SQL Server comes with a very long list of pre-built reports, but these are primarily focused on administering the health of your SQL Server environment. They're not so much focused on analysis of your data. So we have things to pull the data together, do transformations on it that are needed, do analysis on that data, and then display it via a report. Those are the three things that make up your BI offering under SQL Server. Once again, in this video, the focus is going to be laying the groundwork for working with integration services. So let's delve one level deeper. Integration services is a platform for building high-performance data integration and workflow solutions. Bringing massive amounts of information together may not be a one-time event. Let's say with Veronica's, we have various marketing services out there doing analysis for us that we regularly bring into our environment so that we can then use it to make business decisions. So it's not a one-time import, but it's a regular import that could happen daily or weekly or monthly, depending on how often we need to pull new information in. And then we need to incorporate it into our decision-making process. And that's why integration services is so important. It's a tool that takes what could be a mundane, very slow and tedious process and turns it into something that can go much quicker and fit within the time slots that we would have for pulling this in and then making it available for our business users. And then the second half of that is extraction, transformation, and loading operations. ETL is a pretty common acronym in the BI space because it's a very common task that you're going to run into. And integration services is SQL Server's ETL tool. And once again, that means pulling information from various other locations, doing any transformations that need to be made to that information so it fits within the requirements of the new environment, and then loading that information into a new data store. So when you think integration services, primarily you can think of two main tasks. One, merging the data from heterogeneous data stores, because they probably won't all represent the data the same way. They may not even be the same type of a data store. We're not just talking relational databases here. This could be flat file systems. This could be legacy mainframe systems. All types of locations where information is being stored and now needs to be pulled from so that we can utilize it. And then cleaning and standardizing that data. So not only are we looking at inconsistencies in how things are represented, we talked about birth dates or addresses or states, but even there could be just out and out errors in the data. And some of those we can find and fix in our process of transforming it and pulling it into our final data store. So looking at the installation and configuration process for integration services. Well, you'll need to, first of all, install integration services. That's not a biggie if you've done any type of installation with SQL Server. And if you're looking at this video, hopefully you've already gone through the basic installation stuff. There's nothing really new here at all. It's just like any other installation. You simply go through the installation wizard, and when you get to the feature selection page, there'll be an option on there for integration services. Just check that box and then move on through that wizard, and eventually it'll ask you for a Windows account that the service will run under. Once again, if you've installed any other components of SQL Server, you've done that a few times before, including the basic SQL Server engine itself. There's always a Windows account that the service runs under. The recommended rule, as always, is do not use an account that has far more privileges than you need for the service. So typically a generic user account is fine. You don't typically want to run this under an administrator account, but it is a good idea to have a separate account for each service for management purposes. So after you've gotten through the basic installation, there's some simple configuration things you want to look at, starting with the SSIS service itself. It's just another Windows service, so the same rules apply that apply to most other Windows services, such as how is it set to start up? Is it set to start automatically when the operating system starts up, or do you need to manually start it? You typically want to set that to start automatically. Nothing really new there. That's kind of Windows Services 101. And then configuring your firewall. When you're dealing with integration services, you're typically dealing with pulling data from other instances of SQL that may be on the opposite side of the firewall. So you need to make sure that those instances can communicate through your firewall. So let's jump over to our SQL Server environment, and we're going to walk through looking at both of those. First of all, looking at working with the service account, any configuration changes we need to make there, and then we'll jump right into looking at configuring the firewall to allow integration services to communicate between servers. If I need to make changes to the actual SSIS Windows service, there's nothing really new there, but I do want to point it out. If I go to Administrative Tools, under Services, and I pull up a list of all the Windows services, scrolling down to SQL Server, and there's my SSIS right there. It's already started, it's already set to automatic, and it's currently running under my administrator account. Now typically you would want to put that under a dedicated account, so if you need to change that, you can do that from here under the logon. Here I can browse, pick another account. I can have a local account, I can have a domain account, whatever's going to work best for my environment. But typically you want to have a dedicated account. Give it a password, and you're good to go. You can also set things such as recovery in the event of failure when running a job. Currently it's set to take no action. Other options include restart the service, run a different program, so you can have some other application that runs to see what happened in your environment and maybe make some assessment of the environment. And you can also have it reboot your computer in the event of a failure. But by default, it's simply set to no action. And then the other thing we want to look at, I'll cancel out of here, is setting up the firewall. If I go into Control Panel, go to Windows Firewall, and if I go to Change Settings, go to Exceptions, and here is where I would set up SSIS to have access through the firewall. It's actually the MS-DTS server service, so here it is, already set up. But if it weren't already there, simply click on Add Program. If it's in the list here, you can pick it. Since I just recently installed it, it typically wouldn't be here. So if you go Browse, and then you want to go to the location where that file was stored, which is typically under, right here. C Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, 100, DTS bin, and then I'm looking for the MS DTS SRVR. So Microsoft DTS Server EXE. So selecting that, click OK, puts it into the list, click OK, and I already have it in there, so it'll give me an error, but you want to add that in. Another option, by the way, you can either do it by service name or you can specifically add a port. The port number associated with this service is port number 135, so I could go to the Add Port option, give it a name, some descriptive name, such as SSIS, right? Give it the actual port number. I have one S too many, but that's just a description. But this here has to be right. Port number needs to be 135. Then click OK to open up that port. Now, one other thing to note, there's a change scope option here. I click on that. Notice what it gives me. 3 options. First of all, there's any computer, including those on the internet. Depends on your environment, right? Do you have boxes over the internet that should be coming in over this port? In most corporate environments, you probably don't. You probably are here, your own private subnet. So I would suggest that as a starting point. Or if you have specific computers that you know need to have access, the most secure option, just go to custom list and then just list their IP addresses here, separated by commas, and then you've only allowed those boxes to get access. All right? So I'll cancel out of all of this. I don't really need to actually have that come through right now. And that configures those last 2 things. So if I need to change anything related to the service, we saw how to do that, at least one way to do it. And we've seen how to configure the firewall. Now that we've gotten past the basic installation and configuration of integration services, now we need to look at a couple of other configuration type issues. First of all, there is a config file known as the MS-DTS SRVR file .ini.xml. I love the way they named it. It's really an XML file with standard XML tags and data represented in XML format, but it's kind of a throwback to, an INI file, so they kind of stuck INI in the name just for nostalgia. But it's really just an XML file. Be careful if you don't have file extensions visible in your environment. It'll look like an INI file, right? Because your XML extension will be hidden, but it actually is an XML file. So we'll look at that file. We'll look at what's in that file. We'll look at a few changes you can make to the utilization of that file using the Windows registry. So I have on here, you may need to modify your Windows registry in some cases. Don't get nervous. You don't have to go monkeying around in the registry in order to set up integration services, unless you need to, go back a bit here, change the name of this file, your MSDTS srvr.ini.xml file. If you don't like that name for whatever reason, you're using that somewhere else and need to rename it, you'll need to make that change in the registry. Part 1. Part 2, if you want to change the location where the file is located, the location is already, almost said hard-coded. It's not quite hard-coded because it's in the registry, but it's not something you can configure in any other file. It's something that's written to the registry. So if you need to change the location, that's also a registry change. Now, why would you ever need to do that? Well, let's say you're not just running integration services on one instance of SQL Server, but you have it up and running on multiple instances of SQL Server, but you want to have one consistent INI file, XML INI file for all of them. Well, the way to do that is to redirect them all to one central location. So you'd have to go to each registry and tell them the new location for that file. And then again, if you want to change the name, there you might have a good case for changing the name too to some custom name to indicate it's a centrally managed file for all of your instances of SQL Server. But here, let's jump over to my SQL Server box, and we're going to look at configuring the file, some of the things you can change in the file, and look at how you would go about, if you needed to, make any changes to the registry. So the XML configuration file for integration services is added once you install the service under C Program Files, and this is just the default location. Microsoft SQL Server under 100. Under DTS, so there's some remnants of the older feature, the old data transformation services. Double click that, and under the bin folder, I'm just going to scroll down, and I want here it is, MS DTS server.ini.xml. Now, that name is somewhat intuitive, but also could be confusing. If you don't have your show file extensions turned on, it'll look like you're looking at a file with a .ini extension, right? But it's really a .xml extension. Just .ini is part of the name. But if I right-click on that and go to Open With, I have a few choices. If I was going to change it, I would want to use Notepad or WordPad, of course. I just want to look at it, so I'm going to open it up in Internet Explorer. And it's got stuff in there that IE is not quite sure what to make of, but that's okay. What I want to look at, though, is what's in this file. Well, there really isn't a whole lot in here you can configure. Just a few things. Looking at the first one here, it's the Stop Executing Packages on Shutdown tag. Opening tag, close tag for you XMLites out there, right? And it's simply set to true by default, which says if the IIS service stops, stop executing any current packages, which could be helpful, might be detrimental. If you wanted those packages to continue to completion and then have everything stop, simply change that to false. So that's one thing you can change in here. The next thing we're going to look at is here, the server name tag. Mine is currently set to dot. That simply says the default instance. If I'm working with a named instance of SQL Server, or if I'm working with a cluster, I'll have to give the actual name of my server right here. So I want to give my fully qualified name for that. And then the last thing in here that you would typically change is right here, the stored path. This is the default location where it's going to store its packages. So if you need to change the default location, or what if you wanted to have multiple locations, you could actually repeat this line and have it look in every single path listed here for possible packages. So there's not a lot you're going to change in this file, but it's an important file. You can actually also change the location of this file. You may recall I navigated to it. Here it is here. C Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, 100 DTS. That's the old remnants of the data transformation services. Bin, and then the name of the file. But if I want to change that, that's actually a registry setting. If I bring up my registry editor, of course you know you back up before you dare touch this. And I've actually already plowed around in mine. But if I were to go to HKey Local Machine, Software, Microsoft SQL Server, 100 SSIS server config file. Double click that. There's my default location where that file is going to be stored. If I need to change the name of the file or change the location of the file, I need to change that here. You can actually create a central management structure for your SSIS. You can have multiple servers all point to the same location for this configuration file. So the benefit there is you change the file in one place and multiple servers see the change. That becomes beneficial when you start really moving ahead and using SSIS packages and you want to have multiple servers with packages. You can actually manage that centrally by having a single configuration file. So looking at running our packages. When it comes to running an integration service package, you have several different choices. My goal isn't to necessarily show you every possible option. There's probably about a half a dozen, but I just want to get you started on using packages. So what we're going to do is look at the Integration Services Wizard, as I call it. Now, when you look at the menu inside of Management Studio, it'll say Import and Export. Both of those actually take you to the exact same application. And it allows you to import, export data by creating integration services packages. So it doesn't say that, but that's what you're doing. It's a nice little GUI interface. It just kind of covers all the details. But it's a good way to create a simple package to get you used to the concept of creating a package, saving a package, to get some of the different ways you can save a package. And then we're going to also look at how you can go about rerunning a package after you created it and saved it using the SQL Server Management Studio, the SSMS, okay? So here, let's jump over to the server, and we're going to look at using, and I have it in double quotes there, the Integration Services Wizard, because there doesn't seem to be anything on the menu that says Integration Services Wizard. It'll actually say the Import Wizard, and another option will say the Export Wizard, but both of those actually take you to the exact same wizard, which is really a wizard for creating integration service packages. So here, let's jump over to the server and actually do that. So I'm already in my Management Studio interface, and right-clicking on my Veronica's database, go to Tasks, and toward the end of that list, I have an Import Data and an Export Data option. These are two tools that really bring you to the same wizard. Let's go to Import. Notice it says SQL Server Import and Export Wizard, right? Click Next, and the first thing I do is select my source for my data. It defaults to a local SQL Server 2008 database. If that's not the case, I'm going to hit the drop down, and notice I can pick from Oracle, OLAP services, data mining, analysis services, different versions of that. But scrolling up a little further, there's Excel Access and Flat File Source. Well, we're getting regular data updates from a third party that sells us marketing information for new clients. So we give that as a flat file. So I want to select Flat File Source, and then SQL Server, the wizard, comes back and prompts me for, okay, where's the file? Browse to that. That file is in our same folder where we have our database. So if you're copying your files to your hard drive directly from your DVD, you'll find those under C, Course Files, Veronica DB. It defaults to looking for text files, but ours is a CSV file, so I'll change that. And then I see my new customers data file. So go ahead and select that, click Open. It fills in information such as the locale, code page, format of the file. Well, we said it was CSV, which stands for delimited, so it defaults to delimited. And then our header row delimiter, our character return line feed information is put in there. If there are any header rows that need to be skipped, we'll want to increment this number. But we don't have any header rows, nor do we have column names in the first data row. If we did, we would want to let it know that as well. But none of that's needed, so just click Next. Moves to the second window where I can see the columns and the mappings between the columns. So I have new customer numbers, first names, last names. So evidently it's parsing my file correctly, because it looks like I'm getting my addresses in the right field, followed by cities, states, zips, email addresses, birth dates, and anniversaries. So everything's coming in like we would expect it to. So go ahead and click Next again. Here's where it's asking me for the destination. Where am I sending the data to? Once again, it defaults to a SQL Server 2008, my local server, and the database that I clicked on to start the process. I right-clicked on Veronica's, so that's exactly what I want. And also notice it did keep my default setting for authentication, Windows Authentication. Now here on this screen, I get to edit my mappings. There's an Edit Mappings option here at the bottom, where I can tell it what are the source and destination columns and data types, telling it to create a new table. Well, we're not creating a new table. This is a regular update to our customers' data. Now, in a real production environment, I probably wouldn't pull this stuff directly into my production customers' data. I'd be a little leery, or at least back it up before I do this, right? So just kind of throw that out there as an extra piece of warning and or caution. But I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this and go back to the destination area here. Notice it gave me a new table name on its own of dbo.newcustomersData based on the data file. That's not where I want this to go. So if I select this area, I get a drop down where I can choose from the tables that are part of my database. And I'm adding this to the customers table. Selecting the customers table, go back to edit mappings. It's mapping the columns correctly into the table. Notice it's going to the append rows option now as opposed to delete, or the create destination is no longer enabled. So this looks good. Click next, and I get to review data type mappings again. So I can see my customer numbers coming in as a string because everything in the file is a string, but it's getting mapped to the int type. That is the type for the column for that table. My customer number has been defined as an int. Everything else is varchar with a couple of birth dates and anniversaries down at the end, but it's mapping into what's already in the table. So go ahead and click next. What do I want to do next? Do I want to run the package right away? It's checked yes. Do I want to save the package? If I click that, it allows me to save my package to the SQL Server database or to the file system. I'm going to leave it set to save to SQL Server. Click next. Here's where I get to give my new package a name, and I'll simply call it New Customers. New Customer Import, a little more descriptive. Right below that, I can give it a description, SSIS package description, whatever I want for that. I'm going to leave it at the default. Server name, it's defaulting to my local server, that's fine, and still defaulting to my Windows authentication. Perfect. Click next. Here's my last chance to review everything I've chosen and either back up or click finish. And it looks like it's processing my data. 39,506 rows were transferred. So if I click close, go to my Veronica's database, go to tables, my sales.customers table is still in place, I didn't lose it, but let's do a count of the information that's in there. If I do select, count from sales.customers, and we basically should see about double the data that was in the table. And that's it. We just added 39,000 rows, just under 40,000 rows, and there's just under 80,000. So we have a marketing service that's sending us a new 40,000 customers a month. That'd be great, right? But in either case, I can pull that information into my customers table and begin to use that as part of my database. So if I need to rerun one of my packages, if I go to connect to integration services this time, Windows Authentication, it adds that to my Object Explorer. If I go to stored packages, now remember I had a choice of file system or storing them in the database. So I want to look in the MSDB, and there's my new customer import package. By right-clicking on that, I have a few different choices, but about halfway down the page is Run Package. Selecting that brings up an interface where I can set some configuration options and then rerun that package again. Now, if I were to run that this time, I'd get a bit of a problem because I don't really have a new data file with any new customer numbers. So my customer numbers would be redundant. But if I'm getting new files each month or each week, whatever that interval is, I can then reuse this package, which has already been tested and I know works, to pull that information into my database. Some other ways you can run packages using integration services is to use one of the various command line tools. I say various because there's more than one, but I'm going to focus on the DTEXEC command for running packages at the command prompt. Now, there's two variations of this. There's a 32-bit version and a 64-bit version. You will want to be safe, give the full path to the executable. If you've installed them using the default locations, they'll be in these two locations right here. The 32-bit version will be right there under your, whatever the drive is, program files, It's a default folder created by the operating system, right? If you're in Windows 2008, or as I am right now, I'm in Windows 7. You're going to have a program files folder with an 86 folder for all your 32-bit stuff. SQL Server will be under that, and the paths after that actually are the same, whether you're looking at 32-bit or 64-bit. But that's one way you can be assured that you're running the 32 versus 64-bit version of the utility. And when do you use one or the other? That's really basically what are you working with. If you're working with packages that were created in a 64-bit environment, you'll typically want to continue to run those in a 64-bit environment. However, if you have some older packages from another environment, or you're running them on a myriad of different servers, where some of the servers are 64 and some are 32, and you just wanted to create it as a 32-bit package and use the same package in all locations, you can do that. Just make sure on your 64-bit box you specifically say to run it as a 32-bit using the 32-bit version of the utility. Another utility you have available to you that's actually part of the GUI. When you run packages via the GUI, it actually automatically calls the DTEXEC UI. So it kind of lets you know that user interface. But this is 32-bit only, by the way. And then the last option on the list is SQL Server Agent. Remember, SQL Server Agent is a feature of SQL Server that allows you to schedule certain activities, known as jobs, to run at a certain time or at certain intervals. And those activities can include running packages. So that's another way, just like running any other job, this is another way you can run integration services packages by just scheduling them as an SQL Server Agent job. Well, that brings us to the end of this video, and we covered really 3 short but important topics. First of all, we looked at what is SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services, and we talked about how it's a component of SQL Server's BI, or Business Intelligence offering. It was one of 3 main components, right? Integration services, analysis services, and reporting services. The 3 of those make up SQL Server's Business Intelligence components. So we talked about that. We looked at some installation concepts around SSIS. We looked at the configuration file that you'll have to modify if you need to change the default location where the file is housed, right? Or if you want to change the name of the file, we looked at how you could do that. You'd have to go into the registry for that. And then we looked at some configuration things you can do inside of it, as well as configuring the SSIS service itself. And then last, we simply looked at how do I go about creating a simple package and running a package using the import-export wizards as an example of how to create packages. So with that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.